Welcome to part 3 of my Hasselblad X1D review. If you missed the first part where I talked about using the camera out in the real world, taking landscapes and the like, you can check that out up here. And if you missed my first video where I got the camera in the mail and I unboxed it, you can also check that out up there. But this video specifically is going to be about using the camera in the studio, because that's my focus, is studio photography, where I have complete control over the lighting and everything going on in the situation. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Most of the photography that I do in the studio is products, just because that's the easiest thing for me. It's the thing I enjoy the most, is taking a product and getting a beautiful image of it. And I got some really cool photos of a bunch of different things, just because I wanted to use the most out of the camera while I had it, so I could also find all of its quirks. And I also wanted to shoot tethered. Now, shooting tethered is when you connect the camera straight to a computer. So when you take the pictures, they appear instantly on the computer. You can see them on the big screen. You can make adjustments and stuff. You can even click the button on the computer to take the photo. So that way you are not jostling the camera or whatever to take your image. And this is super easy with this camera. It has a USB-C port on the side, which is super fast USB 3, and it's a great connector. It's reversible, it's pretty hefty. I really like having USB-C for everything. My laptop uses it, even my phone uses USB-C to charge now, and that's super convenient, just being able to have one connector for pretty much everything, and the Hasselblad does the same. The main reason that you would want to use a camera like this is the resolution. The fact that I can take an image like this, and I can crop it to be something like this, and you cannot tell that I cropped it at all because there's so much detail there, there's so much resolution. And that allows you to get multiple different, essentially, images out of one image. In order to photograph this ring, I wanted to have it kind of on this like mirror-like surface. But if you use a mirror to photograph, you get this kind of double reflection. Maybe I'll talk about that more in another video. It's a really interesting phenomena. But I wanted to get this kind of mirrored look. And getting a sheet of black acrylic is actually surprisingly expensive, even in a smaller size. I didn't want to spend like $30 on a sheet of acrylic. So I went to the Home Depot and I actually got a sheet of, I think it's Lexan. It was like under $10. I think it was like $8 or something for this sheet. And then I spray painted one side of it black. And then when you look at the other side, it's a nearly perfect mirror. And it's this crazy cool effect that gives you this dark mirrored look that I really love, and it was super cheap. It cost essentially $10 to make this, and it would have cost me more money to buy it. So even though I was using, this crazy expensive, almost $20,000 camera setup, I was still trying to go the budget route because I wanted to not spend an insane amount of money on this shoot. And I was able to get the same effect with significantly cheaper materials than I would have if I'd spent a ton of money. One of the lenses that I rented was the 120mm macro, which is about equivalent to a 90mm macro lens. And I wanted that because a lot of things that I photograph are smaller, requiring me to get the camera much closer. And if you don't have a macro lens, you can't focus that close to the camera. So I needed this specific piece of equipment to photograph things like the rings. But it's also an awesome lens for doing portraiture. So I did some of that too. I invited my grandmother in. She doesn't have really any recent photos of her. And so I wanted to take a really beautiful photo of her that she could post on social media and, give to her family and such. And so I had her come in and, I set some lights up. I use flashpoint strobes. So I had my 600 watt strobe up above, and then I used just a flash gun in the background to get a little bit of light on the back, just to create some interest in the background. And I got a few really beautiful images of her. And When I was using this camera, I had it tethered so I could see the images on the laptop as I took them, which was super nice. It also meant that I could show the images to her while I was taking them so she could see how she looked and think about posing herself slightly differently. It's a super useful tool, especially if you were to have a client in the room with you. So let's say, you're doing graduation photos or something, and you're photographing the graduate and their parents are there and they want to see the images while you're taking them. Rather than them having to be right over your shoulder looking at your camera, they can just look at the laptop next to you and they can see the images as you take them. It's a super useful tool being able to do that. And it meant that I also didn't have to second guess my images in the same way. Because sometimes when you're looking at the back of the camera, it's impossible to tell if it's exactly how you want it. Because the framing can look fine on the back of the camera, but once you have it larger, it looks slightly off, or the focus is a tiny bit off. But on the big screen, you can tell all of those things right away. I also did some quick fashion photos. This was kind of a last minute tacked on thing. I only had like 10 minutes to photograph a bunch of different stuff. And I just wanted to get it out of the way. And so I had lovely model Carmen come in, and she just wore a few pieces of clothing really quick. And we just got some quick photos. They aren't my favorite, but they came out pretty decent. And yet again, the detail is amazing with this camera. The way that you can just punch in and get multiple different angles out of the same shot is beautiful. But the main focus, the main reason that I had this camera was to photograph flowers for my personal project that I've been working on. I talk more about that in one of my previous videos, but I really wanted to get these beautiful images of flowers on a black background, and so I did. I got a ton of flowers. We went to a bunch of different flower shops looking for what we wanted, and we ended up just going to Safeway because they had the biggest selection for the best price. And we got a ton of flowers and then picked out our favorites and groomed them to look perfect and set them up. I had fishing lines strung out so that I could balance the flowers on this fishing line in order to get a shot straight down from what would be the top of the flower. And the macro lens allowed me to get these super beautiful big images, and the color is amazing. Some of these flowers, I'd be like, it's gonna look okay. And then I would photograph it and it would come up on the big screen and it looked amazing. Like this flower, I was not expecting it to look as beautiful as it does. And part of that I think has to do with the Hasselblad colors. They're crazy good. There's basically no editing that went into this image in terms of color. I touched it up a little bit to remove some imperfections and some dust, but the colors are basically exactly as they were out of camera. And that's really special, being able to take images and have them look almost perfect straight out of the camera. Not only did I take images from this top view, I also got a few from the front. And these came out pretty good too. And this was just a matter of clamping the flower onto a light stand, and then I just photoshopped the bottom of the stem out. And some of these images came out better than others. This was kind of the main goal of this shoot, was to get these images, but I ended up liking the images of the flowers from the top much better, which is funny because sometimes things just don't go as you plan and they come out better because of it, and that's totally fine. The main goal of shooting these flower images was to be able to make these giant prints, and that's part of why I wanted the high megapixel count of this camera, so that I could do these beautiful metal prints to put on the wall. This one was a gift to someone in the family, and then these two are going up in a local clothing store, and they are beautiful images. They look great on the metal, but when you get up close and personal and you look really close, you'll notice that they're kind of fuzzy. There's more resolution that the camera has resolved than is possible to print, unless you're using a crazy, crazy expensive fancy printer. These prints cost about $100 to make, these metal prints. But the resolution, there's still more. I could go even bigger with these images and still have plenty of resolution to play with. And that's why I picked the Hasselblad X1D, was that massive resolution. Did I need it? No. But is it nice to have it? Definitely. And one of the main things that I loved about it so much was it made retouching really easy. Going in and touching up the flowers was so easy because there was so much detail there that, on a lower megapixel camera, a speck of dust would be kind of a smudge and it'd be harder to remove. But because the camera is so sharp and so high resolution, I was able to just touch up just that tiny little bit of dust, and then it was gone, and it was a much smoother process. It went a lot faster retouching this image, even though it was a higher megapixel file, which really surprised me. But when it comes down to it, it's not actually that easy to tell the difference when you're just looking at it on your computer monitor at, a normal size. So if I put these two images side by side, chances are You can't guess which one's the Hasselblad and which one's the Sony A7S II. Go ahead and guess. Here's the answer. Maybe you got it right, maybe you didn't. I would say it's about 50-50 wash. It can go either way because both images on even a 4K screen are going to look roughly the same because there's so much extra resolution in both of these images. The Hasselblad can go significantly more zoomed in, and the Sony can't zoom in quite that much, but still at 4K, both of these images are more resolution than you would need. And that means that I didn't necessarily need this camera for this job. But it means that down the road, if I wanted to use this image in some sort of commercial project where I wanted the background of some product to be a flower, like really zoomed in up close, I could easily do that because I have so much resolution to play with in these images. I also used the camera to try to shoot kind of a fake commercial shoot for a energy drink. And I wanted to do this kind of dunking into the water motion. It was way more complicated than I thought it was going to be. I figured I'd just take a fish tank, fill it up with water, and drop some cans into it. I came up with this idea of attaching it to a sheet of acrylic or glass or what have you. I actually got this from Carl Taylor. He did this for, I think it was like shampoo or something. And it's so that you can position the object exactly how you want it. I took a sheet of acrylic, I epoxied the can to the sheet. So that way I could dunk it in over and over again and it would be always facing the direction I wanted. And that was super convenient. It made it a lot easier. But it ended up being that the dunking process wasn't giving me bubbles in the way that I wanted. And part of that was because of the size of the can and the restrictions, the amount of room that I had. But so what I ended up doing was instead of dunking the can, I actually used a straw and a syringe and I taped them together with electrical tape and then I just blew bubbles underneath the can and let them kind of float to the surface and then we'd photograph them. And I photographed many different bubble configurations around the same can and then photoshopped it all together. So I could have more bubbles or less bubbles. I could do it kind of however I want. So after shooting with the Hasselblad for many days and for photographing a bunch of products and some portraits and even, some animals, I came to a few conclusions. The first one is that the autofocus with certain lenses is not very good. With the macro lens, it's basically abysmal. I would sit there and wait for multiple seconds, sometimes 10 seconds, just for the camera to fail and not acquire focus. Autofocus, not the best aspect of this camera. With a wider angle lens, it was actually all right, but with a macro lens, it was pretty awful. The image quality out of this camera is insane, but it's not necessary. Almost anyone can get by with a significantly lower resolution camera, and most people in the end result won't notice the difference. You get these massive file sizes with this camera. These files are like 100 megs each. They're big files, and they require some horsepower to edit them. You need to have a relatively powerful computer. I'm editing these on a MacBook Pro, and it works fine. Sometimes going through the images is a little slow, but editing them works okay, but sometimes there'd be some hiccups. So if I was using a lower resolution camera, I wouldn't have any of those hiccups. I would have more images on a card. I'd be able to get a smaller hard drive and save money there, as well as saving money on the camera and saving money on the lenses. Because essentially when you buy a camera like this, it's an insane investment. It's a ton of money, and it's not going to give you a crazy amount more out of the camera. If you can afford it, I would definitely buy this camera for studio use. Like, if I had $1 million to spend on camera gear right now, I would definitely buy this camera to use. But at the same time, I wouldn't buy an X1D for use in the studio if I had that money. I'd buy an H6D 100 megapixel camera. It would be a lot more money, but I'd build, you might as well just go all the way if you're spending an insane amount of money. This camera seems like it's designed to work out in the world doing landscapes and like I talked about in my last video, but it's better suited to the studio than it is to that in some aspects. And that's just kind of fascinating because this camera was designed to be a companion camera to the bigger Hasselblads that people use in the studio. The X1D is not the camera that someone's going to buy as their first Hasselblad. It might be if you are seriously rich, but it's kind of more intended for the professional who uses Hasselblad cameras already and wants something more portable. But it's best suited to the studio. It's this conundrum to me. It's kind of confusing, the fact that what it's kind of designed for isn't really what it's best at. It's great in the studio. It's an amazing studio camera. But there's better studio cameras than it. And you could spend less money and get something that's equivalent to it, essentially. You could get, a Nikon D850, or you could get, a Canon 5DSR, or you could get a Sony A7R II and get around 50 megapixels and more features and less money. It's fascinating because this is an amazing camera, but there's no real value proposition to it. It's a luxury item. And I talked about this in my last video. I know I've said that a ton of times, but I kind of keep coming back to the same conclusions of this is an amazing camera and I loved using it. I don't regret going back to using my Sony. I'm happy to continue using my Sony. At the same time, I'm going to miss it, but I'm not going to miss it $17,000. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. I know I enjoyed making it. Go ahead and check me out on Instagram to see more sample images of the beautiful photos that I shot with the Hasselblad. And down below you can actually see all of the flower photos that I took. They're up on my website. If you missed part 1 or my first impressions of the camera, you can check them out over here. And yeah, like, subscribe, comment, all that good stuff. And until next time, toodles.